All right, so let's dive into this potential ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It's a story that's been everywhere, and we're going to try to make some sense of it all with this BBC News report. It's a conflict that's got everyone's attention.
Yeah, no kidding. It feels like the whole world's watching and waiting, right? After weeks of intense fighting, it's like this sudden glimmer of hope. But as we dig deeper, we'll see just how complex this whole thing really is. There are so many factors at play that make this ceasefire incredibly fragile.
Okay, so to start us off, can you just lay out the basics of this ceasefire? What exactly is being proposed?
Sure. So it's supposed to start on Sunday. And the plan is for it to last 42 days, 6 weeks. It's being presented as like a critical first step towards a more lasting peace. And they're talking about a phased approach to de-escalation.
When you say phased approach, can you elaborate on what that means?
Right. So in this initial phase, the idea is for Hamas to release 33 hostages that they're currently holding. And then we're looking at prisoner exchanges and the beginning of an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. But it's important to remember that this ceasefire isn't about, like, a final resolution. It's just the beginning. Further negotiations are going to be absolutely necessary to bring a real end to the war and a full Israeli withdrawal.
So even if the ceasefire holds up, it's really just the start of a long and complicated process.
Exactly. And that's where the whole fragility thing comes in. If we look back at the history of this conflict, we see a lot of similar agreements that just fell apart. And on top of that, we've got this really strong opposition from certain groups in Israel, which adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, the report mentions these hard-right factions, and honestly, that's where I start to get a little lost. Could you break that down a bit? Like, who are these groups, and why are they so dead set against the ceasefire?
Of course. So basically, we're talking about groups with very strong nationalist views. They want to see a more assertive Israeli presence in the region. They see any kind of concession to Hamas as a sign of weakness, a betrayal of their whole ideology. They believe that Hamas should be totally destroyed, not negotiated with.
Oh, okay. That actually makes a lot more sense. And their opposition seems to be more than just words, right? The report mentions some pretty dramatic actions.
Yeah, absolutely. Some influential figures within these factions are very publicly opposing the ceasefire. For example, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he's Israel's national security minister. He's actually threatened to resign from the government if the deal goes through. And then there was this really symbolic protest in Jerusalem, a fake funeral staged by Israelis who are against the ceasefire.
Wow, a fake funeral. They really see this as some kind of death.
It's a really strong image, for sure. It shows how seriously they're taking this. And Ben-Gvir isn't the only one. The report also talks about Daniela Weiss, who's a prominent figure among Israeli settlers. She's actively working to overturn the ceasefire.
Hold on, you said settler leader. Can you explain what that means exactly?
Right, good question. When we talk about settlers, we're referring to Israelis who live in communities that were established in the West Bank. It's a territory that's been a major point of conflict. And these leaders, like Weiss, they have a lot of influence within those communities. They often push for policies that would solidify Israeli control over those areas.
So someone like Weiss sees this ceasefire as a threat to their way of life.
Exactly. They believe that any withdrawal from territory that Israel claims is basically like rewarding Hamas for their attacks. And they see it as a dangerous precedent. So you can see how these internal political pressures are adding fuel to an already incredibly tense situation.
Yeah. It's intense. And while we're focused on all these political moves, it's easy to forget that there are real people caught in the middle of all of this. And this BBC report does a good job of reminding us about that human cost, don't you think?
Definitely. And it does that by highlighting the huge contrast in reactions to this ceasefire. On the one hand, you have people in Gaza who've lived through weeks of constant bombing. For them, there's this overwhelming sense of relief, a desperate hope for an end to the violence. And then the report shares this story about Assad Fad Khalifa, this 3-year-old boy who was pulled out of the rubble after an airstrike, kills his whole family.
Oh my gosh. That's just heartbreaking. It's hard to hear, but it's a stark reminder that beyond all the political talk, there are innocent people paying the ultimate price.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective. And then you have reactions from some parts of Israel where people are angry and feel betrayed by this ceasefire. They believe that negotiating with Hamas is a sign of weakness, that they should be completely crushed instead.
So even the possibility of peace is being met with these drastically different reactions.
That's the really tough reality of this conflict. Decades of animosity and distrust run so deep. And the report goes even further by sharing voices from the West Bank, specifically from Nablus. It's a city with a long history of resisting the Israeli occupation.
Okay, I'm interested. Tell me more about those voices.
So we hear from Amina, a woman who talks about this deep desire for peace. She wants the bloodshed to end. She talks about how the conflict has affected women, children, families. And then there's Amma. She sells sweet corn on the streets of Nablus. She also longs for peace. But she recognizes all these really complicated religious and political issues that are standing in the way.
It sounds like both of these women, despite their different backgrounds, they share this common desire for peace, but they also seem to understand just how difficult it will be to actually achieve.
Exactly. Their stories offer a glimpse into the human side of this conflict, a reminder that millions of people are trapped in this cycle of violence, longing for a life without fear.
And that brings us to another really important part of this story, the humanitarian crisis that's happening in Gaza. This conflict has destroyed so much, displaced families, left people struggling to survive. The report paints a pretty grim picture.
It's a dire situation for sure. The report describes an aid convoy coming in from Jordan carrying essential supplies, like food, medicine, all kinds of things. But the scale of the need is just overwhelming. We're talking about almost 2 million people in Gaza who are relying on humanitarian aid.
2 million people. That's hard to even comprehend.
It really shows you the magnitude of the challenge, and it doesn't stop there. On top of the sheer number of people who need help, there are reports of Israeli delays at border crossings, aid supplies being hijacked. And then you have organizations like the UN facing immense pressure to deliver aid under incredibly difficult circumstances.
It sounds like a logistical and political nightmare all rolled into one.
It really is. And amidst all this chaos, the report introduces us to a 16-year-old girl, Lamiz Al-Mazari. Her life has been completely upended by the conflict. She talks about wanting a normal life, the pain of having to rely on charity just to survive, and her dream of simply being able to go back to school.
It's heartbreaking to think about an entire generation growing up like this, surrounded by this conflict, their futures so uncertain. And even with this ceasefire in place, there are still so many questions, so many uncertainties hanging over everything.
Absolutely. And one question the BBC report brings up is this. Why did Israel continue airstrikes even after the ceasefire was announced? Especially that one that killed Assad's family.
Yeah, that's a question that needs some serious attention, right? Was it purely a military decision? Or was there some kind of political motive behind it? Maybe a message aimed at those hard-right groups we were talking about.
It definitely deserves a closer look. And it points to a bigger issue, the role of outside forces in this conflict. The report mentions Donald Trump's push for a diplomatic victory and how that could influence what happens with the ceasefire. Then you have the UN trying to deliver aid and their concerns about the delays caused by Israel. These external pressures add another layer of complexity to an already extremely volatile situation.
Wow, there's just so much to unpack here. This fragile ceasefire offers a little bit of hope, but it's facing strong opposition from certain groups within Israel, and all of this is happening against the backdrop of this massive humanitarian crisis. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's a lot. But I think that's exactly why this kind of deep dive is so important. We got to go beyond just the headlines and try to understand all the nuances, all the layers of this situation.
Totally. And one thing that keeps coming back to me is that sharp contrast in how people are reacting to the ceasefire. On one side, you have Palestinians in Gaza just desperately hoping for the violence to end. And then on the other, you have this group of Israelis who see the ceasefire as some kind of defeat.
It's a powerful reminder of how deep this conflict runs.
Yeah.
You know, it's rooted in history, in trauma, in this deep mistrust. It's easy to get caught up in the political back and forth, but we have to remember the human side of it, the emotions, the experiences that shape those reactions.
Yeah, you know that story about little Assad, the boy pulled from the rubble after his family was killed? It's just devastating. It makes you realize this isn't just some abstract political debate. It's about real lives being shattered.
It's a tragedy. And Assad's story is just one of many. That's why this humanitarian crisis is so urgent. Close to 2 million people in Gaza depend on aid. It's a situation that's been made worse by years of blockade. And now this war. Those aid convoys are literally a lifeline. But it's a constant struggle to get supplies through all the delays and roadblocks.
It's like a race against time with so much at stake. Hearing about Lamiz, that teenage girl who just wants to go back to school but is stuck relying on handouts, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
You think about all the potential being lost, a whole generation growing up with this conflict hanging over them.
It makes you wonder about the long-term impact, especially on the young people in Gaza. What will it take to rebuild their lives? To give them back a sense of hope and normalcy?
Which leads to the big question, right? Will this ceasefire actually hold? Is this really a step towards a lasting peace, or just a break in the fighting before it starts all over again?
Honestly, that's the question that keeps me up at night. If we look at history, ceasefires in this region are shaky at best. But I also feel like the stakes are so much higher this time. The potential consequences are even more serious.
The report also mentioned those outside forces that are playing a role, like Donald Trump pushing for a diplomatic win and the UN trying to get aid in. It shows how this conflict affects the whole world, not just Israelis and Palestinians.
Right. And those international players, they often have their own agendas, their own interests, which don't always line up with what the people actually need. It's this complicated web of influence and power struggles.
It's a lot to unravel, but I think it's important that we try, to understand all the different players, their motivations, how they're influencing the situation. Because at the end of the day, peace is about more than just a ceasefire. It takes a fundamental shift in thinking, a willingness to address the root causes of this conflict.
You're absolutely right. It's about breaking out of this cycle of violence and revenge, acknowledging the pain and suffering on both sides, and working towards a solution that recognizes everyone's humanity and dignity.
That sounds incredibly difficult. I mean, where do you even begin to bridge a divide like that?
It won't be easy, that's for sure. But I believe it starts with dialogue, with empathy, being willing to listen and understand even perspectives that are different from our own.
So it's not just about political solutions. It's about connecting on a human level.
Exactly. It's about remembering that beyond all the headlines and political speeches, there are human beings, people with hopes, fears, and dreams. And those hopes and fears, they're often more similar than we might think.
I like that, finding that common ground, even in a conflict this deep and complicated. But realistically, how likely is that to happen?
Well, that's a tough question. There's no easy answer. But it's important to remember that peace isn't something that just happens. It takes work. And that work begins with each of us.
You mean staying informed, having these tough conversations, holding our leaders accountable?
Exactly. It's about raising awareness, challenging our own assumptions, and demanding better from those in power. We can't accept the way things are. We have to keep pushing for a future where peace is more than just a hope, a future where it's a reality for everyone.
It sounds daunting, but also really important work.
It is. And as we continue this deep dive, I think it's crucial to keep that big picture in mind. We're not just breaking down a news report. We're exploring a story about people, a story that's still being written.
I agree. And while we're talking about all this heaviness, I think it's important to acknowledge the emotional toll it can take. It's a lot to process, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed.
You're right. We have to take care of ourselves emotionally, too, while we're engaging with this topic. Take breaks when you need them. Talk to people. And remember, there's strength in vulnerability.
Good advice. And on that note, maybe we should take a pause ourselves, regroup, and come back ready for the last part of our deep dive. All right, so we've looked at all the different sides of the situation. The ceasefire, the reactions, the humanitarian crisis. It's a lot. Maybe now we can sort of shift gears and talk about the what ifs, try to imagine what could happen next.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We've got all these pieces of the puzzle. Now let's try and see what the picture might look like. Right. What are the different ways this could all play out?
So let's try to be optimistic for a minute. What if somehow the ceasefire actually works? Negotiations go well, tensions ease, and we actually see things calming down. What would that look like, practically speaking?
Well, ideally, Israel would gradually withdraw from Gaza. All the hostages would be released, and they'd come up with some kind of plan to deal with the root issues of the conflict. The security concerns, the territorial disputes, the status of Jerusalem, all those really deep disagreements that are fueling this whole thing.
It sounds like a huge undertaking.
It would take a massive amount of compromise from both sides. And they'd have to build up trust, which is incredibly hard given their history. And then there's the massive job of rebuilding Gaza.
Right. We've talked about the humanitarian crisis, but the physical rebuilding, the social recovery, that's another huge challenge.
For sure. Getting aid in is just the beginning. They need to rebuild infrastructure, deal with the psychological trauma, create economic opportunities. It's all part of building a foundation for lasting peace.
But let's be real here. Peace is rarely easy. What are some of the things that could go wrong? What could make this ceasefire fall apart?
Well, those hard-right groups in Israel, they're still a big concern. They see any compromise with Hamas as a weakness, and they could very well try to sabotage the whole peace process. And even if they don't, there's always the chance of violence flaring up again.
So you're saying even a small incident could escalate and start the whole conflict up again?
Exactly. Things are so tense, so much mistrust. Even something that seems minor could cause the ceasefire to break down. And then we're right back to square one. More fighting, more suffering.
That's a scary thought. But let's talk about that for a second. What if the ceasefire does fail? The talks break down, and the conflict gets even worse. What would that mean?
It would pretty much destroy any hope for peace in the region. We'd probably see a huge surge in violence. Even more people killed or displaced. It could spill over into the whole Middle East, maybe even draw on other countries. It could destabilize the entire region.
And what about the humanitarian crisis? How would that be affected?
It would be a catastrophe. Think about how bad things are in Gaza now. A full-blown conflict would make it 10 times worse.
It's a grim picture, but I think it's important to think about those possibilities, to really understand what's at stake.
Absolutely. It shows how urgent it is to find a peaceful solution, and how important it is to support the people who are working so hard to make that happen.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think we're left with a mix of hope and worry. There's a chance for peace, but the road ahead is going to be tough. It feels like we're at a turning point. A lot depends on what happens next.
We are. The decisions made in the next few days and weeks are going to have a huge impact, not just for Israelis and Palestinians, but for the whole world. We've looked at how complicated this situation is, the different perspectives, what might happen next. Now it's up to each of us to stay informed, engaged, and committed to peace.
Throughout this whole conversation, we've been talking about the human stories at the heart of this conflict. And that's what I'll remember. The resilience of the people in Gaza, those voices calling for peace, the young lives that have been forever changed by this violence.
Those stories are what make this conflict so powerful, so urgent. They remind us why we have to keep working for a better future. A future where peace isn't just a dream, but a reality for everyone.
And that's where our deep dive ends. But the conversation, the search for understanding, that needs to keep going. So to all of you listening out there, we'll leave you with this question. What role will you play in creating a future where peace isn't just a hope, but something real?